Welcome to episode 5 of Motor City UK. I'm Rob Capaldi. As always, thank you to everyone who continues to listen, follow and support the podcast. It's been great to see so many of you engaging with Coventry's relationship with the motor car. So far in this series, we've explored the origins of the industry here in the city, looked at how car culture still pulses through Coventry today, and explored what comes next, hearing about new forms of mobility and the support available to companies finding their place in this evolving sector. If you listened to episode 1, you'll remember Damien Kimberley describing Jaguar cars as arguably Coventry's most famous and important car brand. In this episode, we're going to explore a part of the Jaguar story that's far less visible than the cars themselves, but no less important. We touched briefly on the brand's origins in that first episode, from the Swallow sidecar company through to Jaguar cars, and how William Lyons and William Walmsley made the move from Blackpool to Coventry as the business began to grow. What's less often discussed is the role women played in that early company. From the very beginning, women were taking on significant responsibility, particularly in areas such as sales and administration, helping to shape the direction of the business as it expanded. At the same time, Jaguar's cars were finding success in competition, with several female drivers and co-drivers building their own reputations on the rally stage and the racetrack. In 2024, to coincide with International Women's Day, the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust set out to explore these stories in more detail, bringing together archived material, personal accounts and artefacts to better understand the role these women played in the company's history. To find out more, I travelled to Gaydon, now home to the Trust and just next door to Jaguar Land Rover's Engineering Centre, to meet Lavinia Bentley, the archive assistant who helped bring the exhibition to life.
I just think that people that will come to talk about Alice Fenton, Joska Bourgeois, they had incredible drive. You know, they overcame all the odds against their sex at the time, and they were successful. But I think Sir William Lyons, as head of Jaguar, had a specific talent of gathering teams around him. It just wasn't the women that he advanced. It was the engineers he chose, the advertising team that he grew. He just really had this talent of spotting talent in others. Yeah. And I think that it was very clever of him not to discriminate against the women in his team when he saw their potential.
Yeah. So what was the reason for establishing this exhibition and doing the research into the women of Jaguar?
Well, we try and feature specific days, so anniversaries within the company, anniversaries of vehicles. And just for a change, we decided that we would do something for International Women's Day. And so it was really to celebrate International Women's Day. They asked the archive if we would take charge of this particular exhibition. And we'd been thinking that in our day-to-day work cataloguing, there were certain women that came up time after time who were exceptional for their time and in more responsible positions. And we thought it would be something that hadn't been done before to learn more about their story and try and work out, how they were able to progress as they did at the time.
So before you started going through this sort of research path, was it well recognised that there were these significant women in the history of the company, or were they simply other names that occurred during normal research and when you sat down and thought about it, you could identify that there were maybe disproportionate number of women in more senior positions in those early days?
I think that anybody that is interested in the history of Jaguar would know about Joska Bourgeois and Alice Fenton. I think also Pat Appleyard, who we chose to feature, who was Sir William Lyons' daughter, originally Pat Lyons, and eventually Pat Quinn. So she's very well known for her racing achievements. Yeah. So I think they were women that did have a profile, but maybe their whole stories weren't very well known. And I'm not sure that anyone was that interested in them as people or interested in how they managed to rise above, I suppose, what we call now the glass ceiling at the time. It was more the fact that they had certain positions in the company and they were responsible for different models and, where they were in the history of the company. But I don't think anybody had really looked at the fact, how did these women become so successful in this era? So I think that was the slant we were taking with the exhibition.
How hard was it to find the evidence to show that?
Quite hard, because the personal stories, we don't have that many personal papers in the archive. We have a collection policy, so we're collecting the history of the company, and the personal papers were incidental. They're collected incidentally. They're obviously important, but they don't get handed on in the same way as business papers. Yeah. So we were having to read between the lines. We were having to speak to family members and look at other books that had been written that delved more into the personal stories.
Connie Tether's memoir, A Swallow Summer, gives a rare first-hand account of what the early days of the company actually felt like. Not from the perspective of the founder or a biographer, but from someone inside the day-to-day life of the company. When Connie first joined the Swallow Sidecar Company in Blackpool, she was just a teenager. It wasn't a grand corporate environment. It was small, informal, and fast-moving. She describes an atmosphere that feels much closer to a modern startup than the image we might have of a traditional 1930s motor manufacturer. There was energy, ambition, and a sense that something bigger might be just around the corner, even if nobody could quite define what that looked like yet. At the centre of it all was William Lyons, young, driven, and already showing the instincts that would go on to define Jaguar, particularly his ability to recognise talent. What's striking in Connie's account is just how much responsibility was placed on people at a very early stage. She and her close friend, Alice Fenton, who would go on to become one of the most significant figures in Jaguar's early history, weren't simply office staff in the background.
William Lyons saw Coventry was the beating heart of the motor industry, and if he wanted to expand and succeed, he'd have to move down. So these were two women who were 17 and 19 years of age. So William had to go to their parents and ask permission to bring them down. As you probably know from the memoir, they were put out into lodgings and boarded with local residents. So yeah, they were very young.
Despite that, they weren't simply there to observe. They were involved in sales, in organisation, in keeping the business moving forward day to day. Coventry was a very different environment to the Blackpool they were familiar with. Connie describes the city still finding its footing as an industrial hub, rough in places, unfamiliar, and not always particularly welcoming. She calls it medieval in places and nothing like the exciting modern city she had moved from. There's a sense running through the memoir of both excitement and uncertainty. They were part of something that was growing quickly, but without the structure or security that would come later. It wasn't unusual for Lyons to drive them back to Blackpool at weekends so they could see their families. Senior figures in the company would walk them home in the evenings to make sure they were safe. It was a business, but it was also a close-knit group of people navigating something new and exciting together. That closeness extended into their working lives. Connie describes the intensity of the workload, but also the camaraderie, the shared sense of purpose. This wasn't a rigid hierarchy. It was fluid, reactive, and often improvised, which meant individuals who showed ability, regardless of background or gender, could find themselves taking on significant responsibility very quickly. Alice Fenton is the clearest example of that. From a similar start to Connie, she began as Sir William's personal secretary, but was soon running Jaguar's domestic sales operation at a remarkably young age. She rose through the company to ultimately become Home Sales Director, while still retaining her position working directly for Sir William.
She was almost professional standard ballroom dancer. She played the piano to an exceptional level. She actually started off in Sir William's family's piano business, and Sir William's mother recommended her and said, I think this girl's, too good for the shop. She needs to come and help you. So she was playing the piano in the window of the shop to encourage people to come in and buy the instruments. And when her and Connie lived together, they would sing around the piano in the boarding house with the other people that they lived with. She was a fan of opera. She was a fan of the theatre. She had a huge literary range. She would read aloud to Connie and her sister, who also came to live with them. She would say to Connie, can you stop reading Agatha Christie for a bit? I think you'd really like Ernest Hemingway. So
obviously a very intelligent lady.
Yeah. So she really appeals to me because she had business acumen, she had style, she was always immaculately turned out, and I think she was just an all-round amazing woman.
Yeah. While discussing with Lavinia, we took a look at some of the records and artefacts collected as part of the exhibition.
So we were talking about Sir William Lyne's business acumen. So he actually got Alice to act as a model in the early advertising campaigns. So I think that's a cowley, a swallow cowley there. And that's Alice being model for the ad, which is a fabulous photograph. I mean, I think it really captures the elegance of the car. And that's at Stanley Park. This is in Blackpool, just before they moved down to Coventry. And I think it was the final year before they moved to Coventry. So you can see that she looks quite elegant there in the car. And that's her at her desk as a comparison. So she's looking like a consummate businesswoman there. She's got her own desk and her papers spread out and her inkwell, and she's looking really smart and capable and efficient.
Is this in Coventry? Or is this
that's in
before they moved out?
Coventry. That's in Coventry. So she's probably in her 30s there. I think you can tell from I don't think there's a date on this photograph, but you can tell from the fashion. To me, it looks like late 40s, early 50s. That's not Alice. This is her. This is going into the 50s, later 50s. This is probably just before she died, because sadly she died a few days short of her 50th birthday. Sadly, she had a cerebral hemorrhage, and so her kind of business life was cut short in a way.
Connie's own path diverged later on. She married, stepped away from full-time work and built a family life, something that was far more typical for women of the time. What makes her memoir so valuable is that it captures that moment before those paths separated, when both she and Alice were part of the same journey. The same energy, the same ambition, the same belief, however loosely defined, that they were involved in something that mattered. It's also a reminder that many of those contributions weren't formally recorded at the time. Connie writes about the girls, the other young women who worked alongside them, but many of their names have been lost. Their roles, their contributions, their experiences were largely undocumented.
That's outside the factory. That's her sitting in the car. And this is a picture of Connie and Alice outside the factory the very first weeks that they arrived from Blackpool. So that's at Fosel. And
this paints a great picture of
friendship.
How she describes the location in Swallow Summer with the road being in terrible condition and it being very sort of run down before they started all the refurbishment.
Yeah.
And as you say, it shows the great friendship between the two of them as well.
I love the story that Sir John Black would be driving up to Standard in his car and they'd be walking along in the mud, and sometimes he'd give them a lift on his way because they shared similar area.
There was a great bit in there about the fact that there were the other companies that were on the same site, but they didn't share the road. So when there was the need to upgrade the road, Sir William had to do a big negotiation to try and get them to support fixing the road. It wasn't just as straightforward. We all use it, so please fix it.
So this is from Connie's biographical file. So that's from, I think it's from the Coventry Evening Standard, which announces her promotion to her position. Woman to control Jaguar home sales.
I guess that was big news at the time for such a senior position to be given to a woman.
Mm-hmm. This is a copy of a letter from Alice to Connie thanking her for a birthday present. But it's quite personal, really. So, but we were able to get context from.
It shows you the friendship again, like the close relationship between them.
That's a really nice picture of her too. So that's an extract from Connie's biography.
Was that?
That's by Connie for one of the motoring magazines.
Cool.
So she did a summary of part of her biography, but we've actually got the original typed script, which I can show you, of Connie's biography, because I don't know whether you heard the story that when her husband, Harry, was finally taken onto the board at Jaguar 2, he bought her an Olivetti typewriter, and that was what she decided to type the story on.
I think she wrote it quite a lot later, though, didn't she?
Yes, she did. So he became a board member, I think, in the 60s. This is the memo that announces the sad news of Alice's death. And it's quite telling that at the end, Sir William says, during the 33 years she served as my personal secretary, her loyalty and enthusiasm for the company's progress were invaluable. And I feel that I've lost both a colleague and a friend.
So very highly of her.
Yeah, he wouldn't not usually write anything that personal. So, I think it shows the esteem she was held in.
Again, there was another point, I think, in the memoir about almost the friendship that Sir William had with both Connie and Alice, with them being the sort of early employees, about how in the early days he would drive them back to Blackpool over the weekend.
Yes,
when
to
he
see
was
their
going back
family.
to see their families.
Yeah.
And you almost think that maybe at the time that wouldn't have been a normal thing for the owner of the company to take his office staff and do something so personal as that for them.
But they were quite near in age and they were all very young. I mean, Sir William was born 1905, Alice was born in 1910, so they were close in age and they were very young. It's almost like you'd have a startup today. Yeah. It's really quite amazing when you think how young he was when he founded the company and how quickly it progressed and how young he was when it became a major production factory.
If Connie Tether and Alice Fenton's stories give us a sense of what Jaguar felt like from the inside, then Joska Bourgeois offers something very different. By the time Jaguar began to find its footing in the late 1940s, it's no longer just a Coventry company. There's a growing sense that these cars, these sleek, confident, slightly defiant machines, belong on a much bigger stage. And in Belgium, that stage is being prepared by one person, Joska Bourgeois.
She first came across Jaguars when she was helping with the resistance in Belgium during the war, and allegedly she escaped from her captors in an SS Jaguar saloon, and so she had this affinity with Jaguar. And when she decided she wanted to set up a motorcar distributor company, she apparently bearded Sir William Lyons in his den, came over to Coventry, put a proposal to him, impressed him so much with her business acumen that he gave her the sole rights to distribute in Belgium. So she was an interesting figure. She carried on after the BL days when she was no longer sole distributor for Jaguar. She started importing Toyotas, I think it was, and actually made a whole lot more money importing Toyotas. And eventually, when she retired, I think she had a fortune of about £35 million. So she was quite assertive.
Seems like quite a formidable lady.
Very formidable.
Jaguar in the 1940s was still rebuilding, like much of British industry after the Second World War. Export markets were becoming critical with a strong government push that export was essential for business survival. Steel was scarce, production was limited, and if you wanted to build cars, you had to sell them abroad.
Well, they were only allowed to have steel if they were exporting it. They did get around this because they made the first XK120s out of aluminium. There is a story that Sir William and his team of Haynes, Hassan, Mundy were on fire-watching duty during the war at the factory, and they conceived the XK engine, but they were originally going to put it into a saloon car, and there was a steel shortage, so the follow-up to the Jaguar saloon was kind of delayed, and they came up with the XK120, which, as it turned out, we were talking earlier about fortunate happenings and happenings that were made to happen in the business world. And I think Sir William was absolutely shocked by the reception of the XK120. I didn't think it would be embraced as it was. So it was a sporty model, but it was a real antidote to the war years. Coventry particularly had suffered terribly in the Blitz, and there was rationing, and I think a car like that to be seen at the motor show, which they kind of brought out very quickly in a rush, unexpectedly, and it was there in time for the motor show, and it housed the new XK engine, and they're able to make some in aluminium to get around the steel shortage problem. And the Americans just went absolutely mad for XK 120, so it fulfilled the export brief as well.
Yeah. Joska understood the need for Jaguar to export. She also understood something else. The Jaguar wasn't just another manufacturer. There was something about the cars, the way they looked, the way they carried themselves. Joska's story begins to run in parallel with Jaguar's rise through the 1940s and onwards. After the war, she set about building a market for a brand that at the time was still relatively unknown outside the UK. This wasn't a passive role. There were no established networks, no guaranteed demand. What she was doing was closer to building something from the ground up, finding customers, creating interest, establishing a presence. And she did it quickly and successfully. Jaguar sales in Belgium grew steadily at first, and then with increasing confidence as the cars like the XK120 began to capture attention. These weren't just vehicles, they were statements, and Joska knew exactly how to position them. Ultimately, she'd go on to sell hundreds of Jaguars every year for the next 20 years. As evidence of her forward-thinking nature and willingness to try new things, she began working with Italian coach builders to create rebodied Jaguars that she believed better suited to her market. In 1951, she obtained Sir William's approval to commission a range of bespoke cars. She recognised the need for cabriolet and coupes in Jaguar's product range, so she commissioned Stabilmente Farina to create 3 bespoke show cars for the 1952 Motor Show season. The Flying Jaguar, Golden Arrow, and Jaguar Meteor were intended to have 50-unit production runs each, distributed by Jaguar's other global distributors. The other distributors, however, were lacking Madame Bourgeois' vision and never fully bought into the Anglo-Italian collaboration, leaving the 3 prototypes as that alone, prototypes that never reached production.
And I think Sir William just believed in her. He believed she could do it, and she did. You know, she ran an extremely successful company. The sales were good. She was quite involved in racing with the C-types and the D-types. She went to a lot of the race meetings. She was influential at Jaguar, so some of the speed records that Jaguar won in those days took place there. So I think, you know, it was a good partnership.
Joska Bourgeois' story brings us to the Jaguar speed trials. Long, flat stretches of Belgian road turned briefly into proving grounds, and the records that Jaguar set there in the 1950s. This area of Belgium was one of the few places in Europe where sustained high-speed runs were measured properly and independently verified, attracting manufacturers to West Flanders in the 1940s and 1950s. Jaguar had begun to understand something important. Motorsport was a way of being seen. Success in speed trials, endurance races, and on rally stages allowed the brand to prove itself in public, demonstrating credibility in a way that brochures or traditional advertisements never could. Years later, the industry would package this idea into a neat phrase: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. At this stage in Jaguar's history, with the inspirational women identified by the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust, we encounter figures like Sybil Lubb and Denise McCluggage.
So we then started to look at women associated with Jaguar in other countries, which took us to the Antipodes, Sybil Lubb, who her family had contacted us to say, had we got anything in the archive about her, and told her story. So she was a mechanic, a female mechanic, and she raced Jaguars and she mended them from her dealership in New Zealand. So she was quite interesting.
Sybil Lubb's world could hardly have been further removed from the polished image Jaguar would later project. New Zealand in the mid-20th century demanded something different from both cars and the people who drove them. Distances were longer, conditions less forgiving, and the relationship between driver and machine was often much more immediate. There was very little distance between owning a car and understanding how it worked. She was a successful racer, maintaining and running her race cars and later servicing Jaguars for her competitors. She was fiercely passionate about the brand and famously said, "Everything I have, I owe to Jaguar. They've educated my children and provided me with a nice lifestyle."
And then my personal favourite, Denise McCluggage, not just for her name, which is amazing, but Denise, she was brought to our attention by the Jaguar Drivers Club of North America, Women Drivers Club of North America, they happened to be calling us about something else in the archive. And we said, oh, we're making this exhibition. Who do you think's a really interesting woman that was associated with Jaguar in America? And they told us about Denise McCluggage, who she was an author. She was one of the first sports psychologists. She was a champion skier. She wrote books about sports psychology. There's this quote that I absolutely love from her. Once on a dark, lonely backstretch at Sebring, I had my own petite epiphany. The slower you breathe, the faster you go. So she had a fling with Steve McQueen.
Oh, wow.
She wore this black and white polka dot helmet that was very noticeable. And she had one of the first XK140s that was imported into America, and she drove that quite successfully in races. So
I think somebody needs to get the film rights to her life.
oh, I know. She'd be fabulous,
Yeah.
wouldn't she? And she just lived her life on her own terms. I think she was married to a minor Hollywood actor for about a year and then decided marriage wasn't for her and just carried on having an amazing life.
What connects Sybil Lubb and Denise McCluggage isn't simply that they drove Jaguars or that they found success in motorsport. It's that they engaged with these cars and with the environments around them in ways that felt complete. These weren't participants on the edges of the story. They were fully embedded in it, shaping their own paths for themselves. And in doing so, they helped to expand the picture of Jaguar in this period on a global basis. If Joska, Sybil and Denise represent the outward reach of the brand, that sense of Jaguar being discovered and interpreted around the world, then the story of Pat Appleyard brings us back to something more closely tied to the company itself. For Pat Appleyard, Jaguar wasn't something encountered later in life. The daughter of William Lyons, she was born in April 1927, just a year before Swallow moved to Coventry. The company was an ever-present part of her upbringing. As we heard earlier, there's a certain duality in the way Lyons approached things, a willingness to recognise talent wherever he saw it, whether that was in Alice Fenton or in the engineers and designers he surrounded himself with, but also a set of instincts shaped by the time he lived in, a sense of what roles look like and who might fill them. With his daughter, there was a clear paradox.
She would say that they had a very traditional upbringing, and although she was allowed to go racing and take all these risks, she wasn't really encouraged to go into the business in the same way that her brother was earmarked to go in and rise through the ranks had he lived. So I think he didn't see his own daughter as a possible successor in the same way that he saw his son. So he was traditional in that view, but he was quite happy to promote Alice through the ranks on her abilities.
Pat's early interest was in animals and nature, not motor cars. But her desire to attend agricultural college was not possible. Women were unable to attend at the time. Instead, she was sent to finishing school in Switzerland and secretarial school in London. Her interest in nature no doubt added to her attraction to Ian Appleyard, a keen ornithologist, as well as a rally driver and heir to the Appleyard Jaguar dealership of Leeds. Their partnership, both personal and competitive, quickly became something quite remarkable. Rallying in that period wasn't simply about speed. It was about endurance, navigation, mechanical sympathy, long distances, unpredictable conditions, and a constant need to adapt. It demanded a kind of resilience that went beyond driving skill alone. And together, they seemed to understand that instinctively. What followed, their 3 consecutive victories in the Alpine Rally, achieved without a single penalty point, was at the time an inspirational victory for both Jaguar and UK motorsport.
Appleyards was a huge distributors in the north of England, Leeds. They were major Jaguar distributor for the whole of the north of England. So it was almost like a dynastic marriage in some ways. The Appleyards, he actually went to university and trained as an engineer.
Right.
Then he was active during the war, and after the war they met at a country house party, and he said to her, there are 2 things I want to accomplish in my life. One is to win the Alpine Rally 3 times, and the other is to marry you. So
He did well on both counts
he
there
did.
then.
So they won this cup, the Coupe des Alpes, which I can show you, we have it in our collection. It's very small, but they actually won the Alpine Rally 3 times with no penalty points. So that's why it was such a huge achievement.
Yeah, I think as well they had problems on one of them where there were failures of parts of the car that they had to overcome as well, and they still managed to
Yeah, I
finish
think
with
the wing fell off at one point. They crushed the ring and had to saw part of it off to continue.
This is
But
great.
yeah, so this was hand drawn.
These are the originals, are
Yeah.
they? Oh, wow.
I'm just going to show you a picture of them together. So that's her in her racing helmet.
Fantastic. This car's in
with
the
Alps.
collection,
Yeah.
That's great. And it was the
And
same car for the 3 years, is that right?
well, no, they had 2. They had Nub and Rub. So that's actually Rub.
Okay.
So they're Coventry number plate. So it was, the first one was Nub 120 and that's Rub 120.
Excellent.
But we have Nub. And then he wrote for the company a race report each time they did the Coupe des Alpes, and he wrote it in his own words and
Oh, wow.
typed it out. So this is how we managed to know some of the events that happened on the rally.
Yeah.
And
Was that published internally in the company for sort of a promotion, or
so.
just he just did it for?
No, he just did it. Yeah, for his father-in-law.
Oh, wow.
He called it second time lucky.
The cars that emerged from Coventry in this period weren't just fast, though they were certainly that. They were balanced, capable, designed to cover distance at speed, but also to do so with a degree of control and composure that set them apart. And in events like the Alpine Rally, that philosophy was tested in its purest form. It's no coincidence that these successes fed back into the company's identity. Jaguar would go on to become a brand with motorsport heritage embedded in its very fabric, from rallying to Le Mans and eventually Formula One. The Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust have an impressive collection of cars, including the famous Nub 120, campaigned by Ian and Pat Appleyard. Ian Appleyard took delivery of this car in time to use it on the International Tulip Rally in 1950 with Pat as his co-driver. The car was immediately competitive, coming close to victory on the first outing. The car's major success came on the previously mentioned Rally des Alpes, in which, with notable modifications, Ian and Pat would see no success.
Here is Nub 120. So this is the car that did the Alpine Rally with Ian Appleyard and Patricia. And you can see the sign on the front here.
This was obviously from the third one. That's great.
Yeah, so they won 3 times in Nub. And then you saw the picture of its twin car Rub.
Yeah. Where's that car now? Do we know?
I'm not sure. So you can see it's quite Spartan inside. It wouldn't have been hugely comfortable to be jolting around the Alps in.
No, very much of his time, no seatbelts.
Yeah. And Patricia was the navigator, and she did have an extension to the horn where she could beat the horn, but I think the wire went wrong during one of the races, and she had to lean over and pop the horn every time.
I read that on the on the information about it. It says that they had to keep sounding the horn to get the spectators out of the way because they were crowding the road. So the car looks like it's not been restored. It looks very original. Still got some sort of battle damage, so to speak.
Well, we try to avoid having pristine cars, the patina of the age and the things that have happened to them in their life. We think they make them more real. So within reason, of course. But
so is there anything we should look out for on this car that's sort of special or unique about it?
The fact that it survived, I think, is quite remarkable, and it still runs, considering its history. But we do take it out.
But do we know what happens to the car since it took part in those 3 rallies in the time since then? Obviously, it's still got the original rally plates on it to kind of preserve that. Do we know what's happened since then to it?
Well, we know that very early on, in fact, in the 1930s, there are letters in the archive to say, should we be collecting special cars? So this was also before this car was made, but even as far back as the 30s, Jaguar were thinking of a collection policy for keeping significant models as a kind of museum within the factory itself. So that was already going on, and this car was added to that because we do know that in 1957, when there was a fire at Jaguar, and sadly, quite a lot of the D-types were destroyed, and everybody that was working and people that lived nearby came to help try and rescue the cars. And it was really quite amazing. We've got a whole file on the Jaguar fire where colleagues in the industry wrote to offer help to Sir William, saying, how can we help you out? This is such a terrible thing to have happened. So it was really nice to see that kind of camaraderie within the industry.
Yeah.
But going back to your original question, there was also a letter from the Appleyard saying, sorry to hear about the fire. How is Nub? Did it survive? And luckily it did. So it was being kept in the factory then and looked after. So it's obviously always seen as a significant car.
Yeah. Was it owned by the Appleyards or was it owned by the factory?
Well, it was owned by the factory and it was given to the Appleyards from the factory to race. There was a works race team, but that really became formal in the early 50s, about the time of this car, but that was obviously racing Le Mans, places like that. And it was much more, it came into being much more with the C-type and the D-type. So I think this was more of a family kind of arrangement.
What makes Pat's story particularly compelling is where it sits in relation to everything else we've explored. Because unlike Joska Bourgeois, she isn't approaching Jaguar from the outside, forcing her way into the story through sheer determination. Unlike Sybil Luck or Denise McCluggage, she isn't discovering the cars in a distant landscape and making them her own. She lived at the heart of the company. Her father is founder, her husband a major distributor. She was close enough to the company to understand its origins, its people, its way of thinking, but also stepping beyond it and taking the cars into environments that they had to prove themselves on their own terms. There's a thread that quietly runs through all of these stories, that none of these women were following a prescribed path. Whether they were working in the offices in Coventry, negotiating distribution rights across Europe, rebuilding engines in New Zealand, or navigating mountain passes in the Alps, they were making decisions about how they wanted to live and finding ways to do it. Sometimes within the structures that existed, sometimes in spite of them, and often without needing to define it in those terms at all. Jaguar is not just a company, but a collection of people, each bringing something of themselves to it and leaving something behind in return. The legacy of these women is still there to be seen. In the photographs, archived documents, and the cars and other artifacts that survive, preserved by the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust. The message has changed significantly since the 1950s. Jaguar started to offer engineering apprenticeships to women in the 1970s, and today, of course, diversity is actively encouraged in the organisation. While discussing this with Lavinia, she was keen to point out that things in the past that potentially hindered the ability of women to work in engineering environments can now be seen as a benefit. I read a statistic based upon a recent survey that says that 68% of the automotive industry feels that women are underrepresented in the industry. Do you agree with that? And
statistically, it looks that way. I mean, you can't argue with the figures, but I think you have to look at the reasons why women don't go into the industry. And I don't think it's because they're not interested or because they can't do it. I think it's culture, and I think it's things that are maybe being addressed in education now, such as women being less likely to study STEM subjects. And I think we're coming around to the idea that, well, I think it's probably been a long time that we've realised that women are absolutely capable. It's just giving them the confidence to believe that they are as good as their male counterparts in those areas. I think Barbara Bergemeyer, it was, who was a director at Jaguar, came over to talk to us when we were doing the exhibition, and she had a great sentence. She said, "Don't stand in your own way." So I think it's the attitude. We've got to believe in ourselves more as women, that we're equally capable of doing engineering, STEM subjects. It was really strange, actually. We went to Castle Brom just to do some recording for the archive, and the line supervisors were saying how much better women are at putting in things like harnesses in the cars because their hands are smaller, they're really manually dexterous, they're able to get into small spaces. So working on a track for a woman is, now that the heavy lifting has been automated by robots and things like that, it's much more accessible to women. And I think it's just for people to be aware of these things, that it's not a loud, noisy factory where you have to lift huge, heavy weights. And so, yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. We're definitely underrepresented, but I think it's overcoming the culture and the blocks that stop women believing that they can work in an industry which pays good wages and, is a hugely satisfying career.
The context has changed, but the question of who shapes the industry hasn't. The women who made their mark is no longer on permanent display at the Trust's headquarters. The several interesting artefacts and the famous Nub 120 can still be seen on permanent display. You can read more about the exhibition and many of the others organised by the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust on their website. I'll put links in the show notes for you to take a look. Many, many thanks to the Trust for welcoming me and making their range of archive materials available for this recording. And a huge thanks to Lavinia for her expert insight and for bringing the stories of these women to life. You should take a look at the Trust on social media. They can be found on Instagram. Again, I'll put links in the show notes below for you to be able to see them. They're co-located with the British Motor Museum at Gaydon. Their exhibits are both well worth a visit. Whilst you're on Instagram, be sure to follow the podcast. We're simply at Motor City Pod. All one word, no spaces. You can see behind the scenes as we record more episodes and keep up to date with new episodes as they release. Finally, if you like what you've heard today, please do follow us on your podcast app of choice. Leave a quick review and be sure to click a 5-star rating to help us reach more people with the stories from the UK's original Motor City. Tune in next time as we continue our mission to understand the city of Coventry's unique relationship with the motor car.